Well, hello everybody. Welcome to, I think it's episode number 33 of the Raw Men podcast. And I'm a little sketchy on this one because this isn't one that I've done a whole lot of research on. The topic of the evening is Congressional Redistricting, which I'm guessing has to do with gerrymandering and all of that sort of thing. And we have a professor on the subject of political science who's going to be explaining this to us. And before we proceed, Mark, did you have any announcements you wanted to make?
Yeah. I wanted to say that tonight is going to be the first night since like the first or second episode that we're actually going to be using the Twitter page. We're going to be taking questions. If you want to tweet a question in for Greg or for Aaron or myself, you can tweet it at the tag for us is at the Ramen Podcast. So send us a tweet on there. I don't know how many of you are going to do it, but going forward, we're going to try to do that every week. So that'd be a cool feature. I also want to remind people that after the show, we always have our hangouts with our supporters. The guest and I will stay around for 20, 30 minutes and allow people to ask questions. You can hop into the hangout with us live. So go ahead and sign up at the Ra-men.com. THERA-MEN.com. It's $3.99 a month, $3.99 a month. You get access to the after hangouts. You get access to the Facebook page that we have this private for just members, and you're supporting our marketing. All the money for that goes to help us market the podcast. Aaron and I don't keep a nickel, so go sign up and help us out.
All right, so our guest tonight is Professor Greg Robinson of Binghamton University, and he's a professor of political science. And what can you tell us, Greg, about...
Greg, just go. Just an hour straight dissertation about congressional redistricting.
Yeah, I'm going to go do something important while you just talk. You just take over the show. Go ahead and just narrate, monologue.
Well, the place I always start with this subject is redistricting, gerrymandering, whatever you want to call it, is, in many people's eye, the thing that explains everything that's wrong with our politics. You draw districts that help one party more than the other party. You draw districts that help incumbents more than the other party. You draw districts that, I don't know, support some issue positions or whatever else. It's sort of whatever the opposite of a panacea is. It is the thing that poisons all, is how we draw these districts. And I admit, I agree there's a lot wrong with how we do this, how the process plays out across the different states. I think there's probably something to be said for a different system where we don't rely on districts in order to elect our legislators. There are lots of other countries that do it in very different ways than we do. It has its downsides, it has its upsides, depending on which system you want to use. But Mark invited me, I think, in large part because there was a district he found sort of outrageously shaped.
My district, the Maryland, the 33rd, the 33rd Congressional District of Maryland. If you look at it, I wish I should put a picture up here, but if you look at it, it looks like a crab or something, which is appropriate for the Chesapeake. But it's shaped like a C, and it goes all the way like around. And along the coast of the Chesapeake and through like the richer parts of Annapolis, and it like completely guts out an area that if you're from the area, you know is less affluent. So it just, I think, and I don't think I'm the only one because I've seen memes of it and stuff where people see these pictures and they know their area and they're like, this clearly looks like to me an effort to cut out black voters or Hispanic voters or whatever the group is that they think's getting cut out, and that's why I think a lot of people initially recoil from it and feel like it's a bunch of shit.
Well, I'm guessing I should have brought. I wish that I'd known we were going to be bringing up illustrations because I saw one too. I think it was for Austin, where you had one little pocket of the actual city of Austin, and there's this long tunnel that goes for this one district that goes out of Austin and then goes into this surrounding rural area. So how is that district attached to this little piece in the middle?
Well, it's typically.
Go ahead.
But, well, so there are certain rules that they have to. There are all sorts of rules that the courts have placed on top of all this, but the basic rules are they have to be contiguous, they have to be equal in size. And what's interesting, if you're talking about congressional districts, when they say equal, they mean literally equal. Now, the differences
size,
between
size geographically or size in population?
Size and population is everything. So, I mean, where we grew up, Mark and I come from rural northern Michigan, and basically there's a district of the upper part of the Mitt, if you know what Michigan looks like, and then the whole upper peninsula, right? And this is a massive, massive geographical district. But in terms of population, as of the census, and that's all that matters, the population change between censuses does not matter. That's what counts. And in terms of size, in terms of population size, what the federal courts allow for congressional districts is that they have to be within one person of equality.
Wow, that's amazing.
And it is a fascinating and complex computational problem to the point where I think probably only in the last 10 or 20 years have we ever come close to actually achieving that, because the measurement issues are problematic. Now, if you look at the state legislatures, it's totally different. They talk in terms of percentages, up to, in some states, 5 or more percentage in terms of how much different they can be in terms of size.
So looking at like Aaron's example with because I've seen them like that too, where they'll have a little tiny area and then they'll be connected by what looks like a perfectly straight line going a half a mile or a quarter of a mile, and then it blossoms out. What would cause that kind of weird shaping where it's a population center, a small strip, and then a bigger area? What dictates that area?
Well, the way they achieve contiguity is to use a road and say, well, no one lives on the road. So if they need to grab some population from one place and connect it to another place without, and yet still dealing with these questions of equality in size, they can run it along a road or run it along a river and then grab more people.
Okay, so I'm completely out of my element on this one. I mean,
whoa! Welcome to my world when you're talking about transitional fossils and shit that I don't know anything about.
Okay, well, here's how bad it is. He said that that a lot of people think that this is going to be opposite of a panacea, and I'm thinking, panacea, what the hell is that? And otherwise, what you described is the basic description that you gave for the Congressional Redistricting was how to be unfair, or it seemed to be, and now what you're talking about now is how to make everything equal, and I'm not getting this. Why is any of this a thing? Why is it necessary?
Well, it's written in the Constitution. Apportionment of House districts is determined by the census, which is also itself determined by the Constitution. That's how you get states assigned a certain number of districts. Then they have to draw them to a particular size. Really small states get one awarded at-large House seat. The rest of them have to figure out how to divvy up all the people and make these districts the same size. A lot of factors can go into how these districts are drawn. But for the most part, the Constitution doesn't say anything about whether they have to be fair in terms of partisanship, whether they have to be fair in terms of representing the interests of certain constituency groups. More recent court cases have said you have to think about minority groups, particularly African Americans, but not exclusively African Americans. There's a lot of stuff going on in Florida and Texas and states that have larger Hispanic populations that now you have to consider how districting affects their ability to be represented. But ironies abound in all this stuff, because a lot of the requirements that you draw districts to represent minority populations ends up meaning that you get a few token districts for those populations, and then the rest of the state gets drawn so that they have no representation at all, you know. And typically we're talking partisan terms. Most minority groups vote Democratic. When you draw these so-called majority-minority districts, you get 2 or 3 or 4, depending on the size of the state. And then this is what we call packing in congressional and redistricting generally. You pack a bunch of these folks into one district, and what this means is that they aren't available to vote in these other districts, and thus threaten the political powers that be in those constituencies.
Right, and I think that's what even people that aren't political science professors can see and feel from redistricting is you pack in the voters that all vote the same but not the way you want into one, and then you don't have to win as many seats. It's easier to win other spots. And that's obviously shitty. But before I forget, I thought about something I wanted to ask you, and I'm glad you touched on it because I totally would have forgot. So you said that like some states, like Wyoming, for example, get like 1 congressman because they have such a small population. But how is the number of seats how is that amount set that tells you how many people it takes to get a seat? Is that based off the smallest state?
It is. So any states, so it's a more complex set of mathematical calculations than I can understand, because I'm kind of terrible at math. But basically, they figure out how many states are small enough. They figure out what the population change is. They're working with a fixed number of seats they have to assign, 435 in the House. And so,
so that can't go up even if we have a certain amount of seats? I mean, it's always going to stay the same.
It's been fixed since the early 20th century. So for a long time, we would bump it up as new states came in. And the interesting thing is, before we got the full 50 states, they locked it in at 435, I believe. Anyone watching can correct me. And that's the math, is like, how do you divvy up these 435? So that's fixed. The population is going to shift around. You have to guarantee that every state gets at least 1. And it's this kind of optimization problem where you're trying to divvy these up. And I don't know how many states, so Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas, Idaho might even have 2 districts. I mean, there aren't that many left that only have 1. This is the level of detail I usually turn to my graduate students for, honestly.
But I mean, it's based on the lowest populated state drives the whole thing. Whatever they've got has got to drive the decisions made everywhere else, basically.
Well, no. So their population does not determine the population share that you need to have a single district. That's the crazy thing. Everybody gets 1, and then once you get above a certain population threshold, then you start to get 2, and then you start to get 3 and 4. It's
looking up a map.
Wildly complex.
I'm looking up a map of Texas districts right now, and I'm guessing they're all color coded. And I don't know, like you said, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, maybe if it's a really big state. But it looks like we've got like 10 at least.
In Texas?
Yeah, if I'm reading the color coding right.
You should have in Texas between 30 and 50.
Okay,
Some
so
of them are probably really small,
So
Art. 'Cause I know.
that's the issue with
that's the weird thing about the color coding is because I'm seeing some numbers on here, and they get up to like the highest one I see is 36, but I wasn't sure what the 36 meant. But then they're all of them, they're color coded, and they're only about 10 colors, and I don't understand what that's about.
I guess it depends on the map. I mean, probably different maps have different color codes, but the thing about these congressional districts that I've noticed, because I looked up a bunch of stuff while I was waiting for this podcast, is in like Los Angeles, some of the congressional districts are literally blocks wide, because they're talking about 700,000 or 800,000 people. That doesn't take very many when you're talking, 60, 70, 80,000 people in a quarter mile. So, I mean, some of these districts are super small geographically.
And it's one of the issues with when people talk about gerrymandering and they say this is the source of our problem, or if you define the problem as we elect too many Republicans, and maybe that is a problem, depending on your perspective. The problem is that Democrats have populated the country very inefficiently. So, for instance, some of those districts you're talking about in Los Angeles or around Detroit, or in New York City, which I'm the closest to. It's the closest example to me where I live. You'll find some of these districts you're talking about, and they are 80 to 90 to 100% Democratic. And there's literally no way to draw a district that can take, and again, they're all the same size in terms of population. Right now, that means, I don't know what it's going to look like at the end of the decade, but right now we're talking about 700 or so thousand people. There's no way you can draw a district that connects that population or diminishes it and then draws some line out and then captures some Democrats to make it closer to 50-50. There's just no way you can do it. The map makers, the gerrymanderers are not that clever. The mapping software they use is not that sophisticated. There's just really no way practically to do it. And so you can look at some of the crazily shaped districts. And the thing I always push is think about residential patterns, think about federal court precedents that have said a state with a certain number of African Americans or Latinos, or we haven't gotten there yet, but I'm reasonably certain Asian Americans. These precedents will happen. They'll say when you have enough of this, a large enough proportion of that population, you have to guarantee them some representation. And you start thinking about all the demands that are placed on the people who draw these districts. And I'm as willing as...
Who draws them?
It depends on the state. The typical way this works is that it's passed. The maps are written up by committees or commissions, but mostly committees being outside, but committees of state legislatures.
Okay, so you were just talking about how in New York that you had areas that were 80, 90, or 100% Democratic. I'm having a hard time understanding that. I just went to Southeast Texas for a thing a week ago where there was a huge... There's a big issue with the locals in this small Texas town who don't understand why atheists, foreigners, and Democrats would want to move to Texas. They're arguing that Democrats are some terrible minority group that if you ever meet one, you should ostracize those people. That's how rare they are.
Yeah, but not in New York, not in Detroit.
But that actually illustrates the issue, right? Democrats tend to congregate in urban areas, in particular parts of the country, such that every Democrat who moves to New York City, one of the 5 boroughs, can't live anywhere else, right? So you have this selection effect where people choose where they're going to live, maybe in part because of the local political conditions, right? They don't want to live in certain parts of Texas because of those attitudes. And there's a general human tendency, I think, for people to want to go and live near, with, around people who are more like them.
Well, that was definitely the case in this area, because they were very exclusive. That well, them people ain't like us. Let's lynch them. It was very much like that. That attitude was pretty much what we got.
So you said a couple things. I want to ask a question that you and I talked about in the pre-show the other night, Greg. But first, I want to ask if these districts have to be the same size, why is it that they need to be drawn so erratically? Why can't they be more straight-lined, at least, to where a person looking at it would assume that it seems fair? I'm not saying it's going to be, but what's the point of the crazy lines? Why do they jag down one block and then back on another block?
Well, there are people who argue this, and the answer is the Constitution doesn't require that.
They do it because they can.
Basically, but there are people who argue this ought to be a consideration that the courts make, that what you're referring to is compactness, which is they ought to not have these big jogs out. They ought to be sort of, and you can look at this in some states. Iowa's probably a good example. Outside of Detroit, Michigan's actually a pretty good example. They almost actually follow county lines, but there's no requirement that the people who draw these districts have to do that. This is a sort of ethical and normative argument that people who evaluate this stuff make, that they ought to be compact, that they ought to. So compactness, communities of interest ought to be kept together. So if you're thinking about, whatever, it's you're in Appalachia and you're talking about the coal mining part of southeastern Ohio or of western Pennsylvania. Well, that place is all about coal mining and the interests that go with it. Like it or not, that's what they're interested in. And the sense is that ought to be all in one district and not divided up, or whatever else the interest might be.
Well, it seems like
these are standards of evaluation that we impose on a system that is not required to follow them, does not really even purport to.
Okay, so why do we impose this?
Why do we impose those standards, or?
Yeah, I mean, it's still basically the same question as why do they draw these crazy lines? And I was just looking at some maps, and I included a couple of links up there for you to look at of some examples where they, most of the time they do seem to follow some sort of county line or something like that, but then every now and then you get something crazy. Why is it suddenly something crazy?
Well, some part of it is, and I worry that I'm sounding like an apologist, which I'm
we're
not.
used to that. We're used to that.
I don't really do apologia, but part of the problem is you look at the maps and, I think, Mark, in your district, you kind of know what the layout of the population is. But in other places, you're looking at something where that's where the people are. and that's why, you needed to make this district, if it's a congressional district, roughly 700,000 people. Like, where do we find them? And we go and we find where the people are to add it up to 700,000. And if you actually look at the complexity of, so I have some colleagues right now who are working on issues like this, which is why I felt comfortable at all doing this. I'm actually sort of peripheral to the project, but what they're trying to do is to write a computer program that will take a state and will draw a series of random congressional or state legislative or whatever maps and do like 1,000 of them, and then compare the one we see to this distribution of random districts and evaluate it for partisan competitiveness, racial imbalance, whatever criterion you want. You could do compactness. Do the random districts we draw in trying to do the same things they're trying to do they look weird too? You can actually evaluate some of this stuff, and the depth of the programming that goes into writing the code for these programs is just insane. I mean, this is why I'm peripheral to it, because I don't know anything about this stuff.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not a computer programmer. I would be making much more money if I knew how to do this sort of stuff.
Okay, so once again, you're back to kind of the same question that we've been asking, and maybe if you've answered it and I didn't get it, and maybe I'm just dense. But I mean, why don't we just have, like, everybody has a vote, and so you don't need a district? Why do we have to have? Do we have 300 million people? Why not just have a simple majority? Why do we have to have all these districts divided?
Man, that's a deep question.
Well, we don't. There are places in the world where they have what we call proportional representation. Most of these places actually do still divide everyone up into districts, but for instance, Israel is a national district. That's all there is. And you go and you vote for a party, and every party is awarded a number of seats that is roughly equivalent to the proportion of the vote that they won.
I'm so apolitical, I don't even understand why we have parties. Because, I mean, you look at people in different parties and you say, well, this person's really liberal for that party, and then this person says he's a Democrat, but really there's kind of like a soft Republican Democrat. Well, why do we have all these divisions then? Why not just vote for the people?
Well, it's very difficult in any one of these systems, whether it's ours or, the sort of pure proportional representation system that Israel and a few other countries represent. It's very hard to hold people accountable, right? If you say I'm voting just for the person, and the person, for instance, Barack Obama says, I would like to have done more to, combat the recession that we saw. I would like to have done a different kind of healthcare reform. But a bunch of the other people didn't want to go along with me. So when you evaluate him, do you evaluate him on his intent, or on what he was able to achieve? What he was able to achieve is dictated largely by what other people were willing to do. And this is the sort of folk wisdom of political science, is that you may hate parties, but parties are really the only thing that allow us to do the most important thing in democracy, which is to hold people accountable. To say, you told me you were part of this party. This party did things I didn't like, and therefore I'm going to, because you're the only one I get to vote for, right? In our system, who do we get to vote for? In the national system, we get our House member, we get our senator, we get our president. That's it. Right? I can't vote against all the shitheads from other districts who did shitty things. I can only vote against the guy who went along with it, whether he wanted to or not, right?
Okay, so like in the last Democratic in the Democratic debate, you had Webb up there who seemed like the most Republican Democrat I think I've ever seen. So I mean, there were people tweeting all over. How is this guy a Democrat? Clearly, he just wasn't able to fit into the clown car with everybody else, so he went to the Democratic debate instead. That seemed to be the situation. Yeah, I'm not very much for parties. I don't identify as a Democrat necessarily. I mean, I have to vote Democrat, because look at the opposition. But I mean, you have a whole lot of unity within the Republican Party. And then you have like this, the way I see it, you have this collective of other people that end up having to vote for a Democrat because it's a forced two-party system. And I don't understand why that has to be.
I guess, I mean, from what I've always understood, it doesn't have to be, but the process of changing it allows us to run the risk of the other party, if they don't go along with it, taking fucking everything. So if the Democrats split their vote up and try to make it more of a several-party system, you run the risk of the GOP not doing that, and they fucking win everything. Is that what it seems like, Greg?
It comes down to two people no matter what. I mean, ultimately it does. I don't understand how you can have multiple party systems because it always ends up boiling down to a competition of two people regardless. I would just like to see some kind of different system of elimination. I mean, like I said, this is a little bit out of my out of my area of expertise. I was so apolitical, so disinterested in politics as a young man that I remember I went to the Iowa caucus in '88 with some friends, and they insisted that I register to vote, which I had not done yet ever in my life. And they said, Republican or Democrat, and I said, I don't know. I really don't know. I don't know what either of those mean. And the girl that was filling out the form says, you're a Democrat. I'm like, how do you know? And she just looked at me with a raised eyebrow and said, trust me.
It's the long hair, you fucking hippie. So
well, anyone who spends that much time talking about transitional fossils
is going to be a Democrat, yeah.
And is asking and isn't asking where the hell are they if they're not there.
Yeah.
Then,
well, it sounded like it was intended to be an insulting generalization when you said that the Democrats tend to congregate around urban areas. Yeah, you got to disperse those groups of Democrats. They're always congregating in those urban areas.
Well, it's true. It's empirically true. If you look at in states where we have it, and most states do, Michigan does not, where Mark and I grew up, but people register as members of parties, and the urban areas, whether and it's not necessarily just minorities, but it's also everyone who goes to urban areas tends to be a person who's more likely to be of the left. Some of the people on Wall Street in New York aside, although even they tend to be socially more leftist. It's just the way it works, and it's a we use this term efficiency of if you could choose as a political party how to disperse your supporters geographically, you would not have anywhere near 70% of them live, anywhere where 700,000 people were grouped. You would spread them out much more efficiently.
You'd want to win every election by 1%. That would be the most popular way to do it.
Well, you as the party would, the candidates probably wouldn't. So the candidates would rather say, I'd like to win by like 5 or 6. So they're not going to be perfectly efficient because
anything can happen.
Yeah, they're self-interested actors. They're not just automatons who do the party's will. They view it as a pretty good job.
Trump, baby.
Who knows with that guy? I think he's probably anything but an automaton. He is a I don't know. I'm pretty sure he doesn't believe anything he says.
You said he was a self-interested actor.
Yeah.
Who is not doing the party's will. And that seemed to be a perfect description.
Well,
since his own party.
In that case, yes.
Since his own party is upset that he's leading in their own polls, and he does seem to be acting. That doesn't not seem to be a sincere performance. I fear that it might be, but it doesn't seem like it is.
I was talking to Shannon about it, and I said, don't think for a second if Trump thought he had a better chance of winning as a Democrat, he wouldn't be a fucking Democrat.
He's already tried that.
Yeah, he doesn't give a shit at all about political parties. So I wanted to ask.
Let's not hold that against him because Eisenhower did the same thing.
See, now I didn't even know that. Now you're going off the deep end on Arn and I both.
So nobody. I'm sorry. I'm getting another beer. So
that's okay. That's part of the gig.
I was hoping so.
Let me ask this real quick before we move on. So we talked about the House of Representatives and all that. Now the Senate seats, there's 2 per state. Now are those split up at all, or do they represent the whole state? Both of them represent the whole state.
They represent the whole state. The only thing that distinguishes them is when they are up for re-election, which is one of the things I have not talked about is people point to gerrymandering and they say this is why our politics are so polarized. This is why the Republicans are crazy or the Democrats are crazy or both are crazy. And it in a straightforward way, it cannot be, because the same damn stuff is happening in the Senate as is happening in the House, because we don't have redistricting, right? They stay the same. Now, it could be this sort of convoluted process where you go to the House, you get sort of socialized into this is how you be a congressman, you then run for the Senate, and then now you're like, I'm like a House member. I don't care how you guys do things. I'm going to do them the way we do them in the House. And that means being polarized, which could happen. But if you think about the incentives, it's not really clear that that's how any politician necessarily behaves, right? We don't expect politicians to keep doing the same things as conditions change. We expect them to adapt. We expect them to understand what the incentives are, because honestly, when you run for a bigger, more diverse, more moderate constituency, it wouldn't really seem to make sense for you to be the same crazy right-wing nut you would be if you came from, again, I keep coming back to this, rural northern Michigan, right?
Yeah, it seems like
and yet they have. So
right.
It's one of those things like, we know what has happened. We're not really sure why it's happened.
It seems like the more fringe elements, both the most liberal of us and the most conservative of us, are in the House, because the states are more diverse. So you have to be more of a centrist at the senator level.
You would think that, but it's pretty much not true. Like, they are as extreme. The same trends in polarization that we've seen between the Democrats and Republicans in the House have shown up in the Senate. So
I was just looking at our Texas Senate and our 2 state representatives, both Republican, of course, one of them being Ted Cruz. This is how bad our situation is. And then as I go through the other Republicans, I think, or the other, excuse me, I should have said representatives. No, it doesn't matter if I said representatives or Republicans, because there's only a handful of non-Republicans in that whole mix.
Right. And that's fucked up, because, I mean, Texas has got, like, 18 or 20 million people or whatever it's got in it. And there's, even if it's a minority, you still have 8 million Democrats that are having a hard time having their voices heard in a situation like that.
Well, that's why they were posting on Facebook, all those people in Southeast Texas. I don't know why them Democrats want to come. Democrats and communists. And
they always lump in atheists with communists, don't they?
Yeah, but in this case it was funny.
That's the trick.
Atheists, communists, Democrats, and foreigners were all the same thing. Oh, and I forgot, Muslims.
Oh, right, yeah.
Because I've actually seen there's a lot of these rural groups here in Texas that actually identify Muslims as atheists.
Well, we always get identified as Satan worshipers, too. That's the first thing you always hear is...
Well, yeah, because Muslims and Satan worshipers are the same thing, too, because if it ain't from Jesus, then it's of the devil.
If it's not
I've actually heard that as well.
If it's not Scottish, it's crap.
Exactly. So if you're not a Republican conservative Christian, then you're some kind of devil worshiper. If you don't worship their God, their version of it, then you're an atheist, regardless whether you worship some other God. It's a very exclusive, like, little collective there. Kind of creepy, kind of scary.
So what initially? I don't remember what initially made me post about the congressional districts and what made me look up my personal congressional district anyway. But it was something's going on where there's a push to kind of change the gerrymandering and change the congressional districting within. I mean, is that the House? Is that Congress pushing that, or is that outside entities pushing that? To try to change it.
To reform how it's happening?
Yeah.
It's, for the most part, this is generated from the states. So this is another. I feel bad about this. Like everyone says, I've identified a problem, and I say, well, it's not really a problem, or yes, it's a problem, but there's no way to fix it.
Yeah, you're an asshole.
Yeah, pretty much. That's my job description, I think.
Right.
So the issue is, so I said the state legislatures, and every state but Nebraska has 2 chambers. So someone draws a map, they argue about the map, they rehash it, they send it to the governor signs off. Often there's a court challenge or something else. So a few places have tried, and increasingly this is the proposal, is to have some independent commission draw these districts, and then that will solve all our problems. And then, of course, the independent commission is 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and they either can't decide or they draw. I mean, if you wanna find the real problem with the way our districts are drawn, if you want to find the real problem with the way everything in our politics works, it's that it's about protecting incumbents.
Right. Right. Once you're in power, all you do is try to maintain power. You don't give a shit about anything else.
And all this stuff, the arguments about, the debt ceiling or this or that, it's all. And you guys should do a podcast about this.
Aren't we?
Yeah, what are we doing right now?
This term, kabuki theater, right? When people say this, like, it's kabuki theater, it's like, well, that seems kind of offensive. I'm pretty sure you don't even know what kabuki theater is. Like, bad...
I don't know what it is. I'll admit I don't know what it is right now.
Bad racist analogies might be a good subject. But it's basically this. It's like this pro forma. We're going to go through these gestures that are highly ritualized, and yet they mean nothing, because what we're really doing is something behind the scenes. So I always hear this term, and I'm like, I've looked it up. I'm like, So I hear this, political pundits and whatever else will say, it's all just kabuki theater. I'm like, you mean like ladies, Japanese ladies with white paint on their faces in kimonos doing weird gestures, which I was already doing when I was describing it, right? But I mean, that's what this stuff ends up being. Like, we're going to create this nonpartisan commission that's going to draw these districts, and we're going to argue with each other, Democrats and Republicans, and at the end of the day, we're all going to pat each other on the backs and say, hey, guess who gets to keep their job for another 10 years?
So you mentioned that when I asked about who draws the lines, when I said, actually who does it, you said that the state legislatures draw the lines. So the state legislatures draw the lines for the federal government? Mm-hmm. Is that right? So if you have a state that is red, they would have a reason to try to draw the lines as red-friendly as they could, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, the one thing that prevents them from doing so is that there are very few states that are that red that they could give every district to the Republicans, and it would make that much of a difference, right? Like, so most of these really Republican states, no matter what system you used, they're going to be Republican, because that's who votes. And this is the dirty secret of all this stuff, is that the districts are drawn by population, but they're also drawn with an eye towards who actually shows up, right? It's not voting age population. It's not voting eligible population. So one of the crazy things is that the prison population actually counts towards these districts, and yet they're not allowed to vote in I think all but a couple of states. So all these people count, and yet they can't vote. And beyond that, it's politics is a turnout game. Now it's like, can you get your voters to turn out? And these districts are drawn so that, a lot of these urban districts are 90+% Democratic. There's 700,000 people, and if you get 300,000 of them turning out, you're lucky. And so this advantages Republicans at the state level. It advantages Republicans at the presidential level.
So are the districts drawn for the state representatives too?
So they draw their own districts.
Oh, well, that's fucking good.
In almost every case. I mean, that's how the game is played. And this is all written in the Constitution. Like, the states determine how. Like, the apportionment is a formula that's dictated by the Constitution. The states could actually do very different things. Like, a state, if it wanted to, could do proportional representation, where you go and you say, well, vote for a party, and then, if you're Michigan, I think they have 14 or 15 House seats, go and you vote for a party, and then we proportionately award the number of seats without regard to any geographic constituency. Everyone would represent the state. That's,
Do any states do that?
No. And, some people have argued that you could challenge it in court if they tried to do it. And with the current federal courts, who knows? But, I mean, the literal wording of the Constitution would suggest they can do pretty much whatever they want, as long as people are allowed to vote on it.
So we only have 10 minutes left. I want to ask you about some things that are political, but not related to congressional districting. Some of them.
I would love that.
Some of them are actually.
I've exhausted what I know about redistricting.
Some of the things are actually of interest to the atheist and secular community. A person in our community named Amanda Knief, she wrote a book called Citizen Lobbyist. Very good. She is she's a member of the American Atheist Leadership Team, and she works in D.C. On lobbying issues and secular issues that support atheist voters. American Atheist has an atheist voter campaign. They use an atheist voter hashtag for people to be able to talk to their members of Congress and say that they're an atheist. Like, what are you going to do for me? And it's been very successful. It's a good idea. But what I wanted to ask was when we're talking about how do I say it? How do I phrase this? When we're talking about the idea of getting things really done, the secular community has kind of started rallying around the only thing that really matters is the presidency ultimately, not Congress at all, because the people that nominate the bench on the Supreme Court are the people that are really going to drive change in the future. Now, I know that the Congress has to approve the Supreme Court justices, but that's kind of the mentality that a lot of people are taking now, especially in the secular community, saying we've got to make sure that the court gets more liberal going forward. Do you think that's a strong idea, or do you feel like that's actually not necessarily where we need to be focusing our attention?
Well, I think it matters. I mean, it clearly
that
matters.
seems like the main thing. It's like you got to vote Democrat because Democrats are going to vote liberal fucking justices, and that's what's important.
So I'll say I'll take that as given, and then I'll say you got to look beyond, because there are so many offices in this land that have an effect on your freedom to religion or non-religion. I mean, just look at some of the stuff that happens down in Kentucky with this lady who's not gonna, who doesn't want to give marriage licenses to the gays, right? Like, that's her perspective. Like, I could never do that. That's not what marriage means to me. Well,
yeah, and then the Pope shows up and says, "You go, girl."
Exactly.
That was fabulous.
Exactly. I mean,
thank you, Pope.
Also,
and then he gets it back to his own constituency, and they're all like trying to repair the damage. Don't you love that?
I don't know what happened with that. I don't know if he really fucking supported her, or if he didn't, and people try to spin it like he did. I don't know. But
if you get a private meeting with the Pope, do you think he supports you?
Aaron, I think you need a private meeting with the Pope. But yeah, Greg,
personally, I would say I would not care to meet with the Pope. One of the conditions of being an American citizen is rejecting all allegiances to foreign potentates. And last I knew, he was the head of state of Vatican City. I'm channeling my father here.
Well, there's another issue too. Is like George Carlin said that he has just as much authority as the Pope does. It just doesn't have as many people who realize that.
Right.
Yeah, but I would correct. But people who are interested in these issues, I was actually just teaching in one of my classes the other day about the difference between activism and participation. And I think there's an important distinction there. I think that the atheist, the free-thinking, the agnostic, the whatever community, like this whole set, there's a lot of activism and there's not enough participation. And what you have to understand is
a fucking fact.
You have to turn out to vote, and you have to recognize that you are going to have to choose among a shitty set of options, and yet you still got to choose the best one, right? There may be no one you want to vote for, but there will be someone you want to vote against.
Right.
You got to show up.
Mayonnaise or mustard on that turd sandwich.
Right.
Exactly. Make it taste as good as you can, but honestly, the presidency is not enough, because your senators, if you're only talking about the court, you have to have some influence over your senators, because they have a role in how the courts
that's another funny thing. You have all of the midterm elections that like nobody turns out for. The Republicans always do well whenever there's low voter turnout, and they have unity where the Democrats and the Green Party and all of those don't. There's very little unity within the Democrat Party as compared to the Republican Party. But they always vote according to their party lines, pretty much the way their pastor tells them to. So that's what happens whenever there's apathy anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. This is why I think it's important for people to recognize that party is important, to recognize that you don't necessarily have to have a party that you're committed to, but you probably do have to be an anti-partisan. You have to recognize...
You have to be against whatever group you don't like.
Which is sad. Which is sad to think that that's what it has to be, but that's human nature, right?
Well,
what I would say is...
Okay, so I'm kind of an idiot politically, and I'm sure everybody listening to this show has already figured that out, but I mean, if I want to vote for somebody, I'm really going to vote on the issues. It's kind of always been the position that I have, and I know everybody else in this state, they walk in and they do the straight voter ticket, just R, everything beginning with R, vote for that, and they leave. And never, I talk to some of these people, and I try to get them to understand what the issues are. They don't care. They're just going to vote for R.
And I admit that, like, I try to vote specifically on issues, but if it comes to a local school board or whatever, if I don't know the candidates, I always vote Democrat, because I know that their chances of being in line with my mindset are closer.
Well, now you've got a good point there, because so far, while I want to vote on issues, when we're talking about a Republican candidate, thus far it has always been the case that they're proposing something disastrous, or they're completely unaware of something else. It's just, this is definitely the worst possible option.
Right, and that's what Greg, I think what Greg was saying.
Yeah.
Vote against what you hate.
I'm tired of voting, for the lesser of two evils. So there's rare occasions when I can actually vote for somebody that I actually want to vote for whatever reason.
Well, that's the world we live in.
It's
only the utopians who of the religious or the other.
The libertarians. The libertarians are big time utopians, man.
Who propose any sort of utopia? We're always living in.
So I want to give a
the best of
question
all possible worlds.
real quick. We had a question on Twitter. One question. It came from a person called the Dr_Wood. That's their Twitter handle.
All right.
And this is interesting, Greg. Their icon is the Spartan, the Sparty mascot. So maybe a Michigan.
I wonder if I might know who this is.
You may know it. It says from Carthage, New York. Carthage, New York. But the question is, Dr. Robinson, other than a salamander, what shape would you like to see a congressional district?
Do you know the angel figure on the Led Zeppelin album covers? Like, that's what
that would be a good one.
I want to see a district shaped like that.
Yeah.
I don't know what else.
Thanks for watching the Dr_Wood. I appreciate it.
Maybe like something like a Georgia O'Keeffe painting would also be lovely. But
All right, and that about wraps the show.
You did it, Greg. Good close, man. Good closeout.
Yeah. And you know what the funny thing is? I've only had one question the whole time, and I still don't know why the hell we do this.
Right. Right.
My own personal ineptitude is what I'll have to chalk that up to. I also don't know what a panacea is. I didn't get that answer either, but I can at least
that'll be in the
one.
after show. Greg will describe what a panacea
I'll look it up to make sure that I know what it means.
Oh, yeah, we got to cheat. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and end the show then, and thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night.